Now I have the honor to open the second day of the conference and welcome on the stage the moderator of the first session, Professor Tyrowicz. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Welcome, everybody. My name is Joanna, and I will be chairing this session, but the statement that I'm going to chair, the people you're going to see in a second, is just completely outrageous because we have really spectacular guests for today. The panel consists of 4 exceptional speakers. I'm just going to go as I see them showing up on the screen. So the first one is Magda, professor at Warsaw School of Economics, a labor economist and the founder of the Institute for Structural Research. I think we're going to see soon enough the face of Wendy. Carlin, Wendy, can we call you in? Hi, Wendy. Wendy is a professor at University College London, and she's also a founder of a huge and very powerful initiative called cohort, which introduces or spreads the new way of teaching economics around the world with incredible success. We also have Martin Kahanec, who you will see in a second. He'll be sitting by my side. Martin is a professor at Central University in Vienna. And he's also a founder of the Central European Labor Studies Institute in Bratislava. And Jan Svejnar, professor at Columbia University, a founder and professor at CELSI in Prague. All of them have made huge research about labor developments during transition and later on. And I hope that today we can discuss those issues. But we're going to start with a presentation by Wendy. I am very eager to hear her comments because Wendy thought to tell us how our understanding of economics as a science has changed between the early transition and today, and how we should teach economics or think about economics these days. So Wendy, the floor is yours, and we're super eager to hear your insights.
Okay, fantastic. Great, thank you very much, Joanna. It's fantastic to be here. So let me just begin. What I did was to, if you like, take our exam questions, which was to think about the implications for labour markets of trends in inequality, automation, immigration, and structural change. And what I want us to think about is that the elimination of routine jobs and the increasingly knowledge and care-centred character of work, of how we make our livelihoods, is shrinking the share of work that can be effectively governed by hierarchically ordered and unequally rewarded positions, and increasingly requires intrinsic or social motivations to undergird a high-performance economy. So this is looking out to the future. These changes are on a scale that calls for a new paradigm in economics. That's what I'm going to argue. And so we need to know what that is and what a new one might look like. So a place to start is what we've all been experiencing over the last 18 months. And look what the economists said way back in March 2020. Big government is needed to fight the pandemic. What matters is how it shrinks back again afterwards. A pandemic government is not fit for everyday life. The Financial Times said something different. Radical reforms, reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades, and that's where I'm going to connect this to the paradigm, will need to be put on the table. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. Policies until recently considered eccentric, such as basic income and wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix. So how should we think about all of this? Well, one way is to think of what a policy paradigm is, to think that it addresses the pressing problems that we face in the economy, and that it comprises 4 different elements: normative foundations and an economic model, and those 2 things have to work together, as I'll try to explain. Emblematic policies, which implement the normative foundations and the goals in the economy. And we have to have a way of talking about it in everyday life. So we can think of classical liberalism, Keynesian social democracy, and neoliberalism as paradigms. So let's be more concrete and think about classical liberalism. So what are the normative foundations? They're a particular view of freedom and of order, an anti-paternalistic view of individual autonomy, so a move away from traditional hierarchies and emphasis on equal dignity. So the complementary economic model was the one based on the division of labour, specialisation, comparative advantage, and had at its heart cardinal utility as a welfare measure. So we then have the classic policies that we know, the Corn Laws, anti-tariff, and so on. And Adam Smith talked about this in a way that could be, relayed. It's not the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. So that prevailed. Then there was a crisis, the Great Depression, and new problems emerged, and with it a new policy paradigm, Keynesian social democracy, bringing in additional normative foundations focusing on security and fairness, the new economic model to explain, to account for persistent unemployment. So we have paradox of thrift, the theory of the second best, and so on came in. And we have a new set of emblematic policies, demand management most obviously. A different way of talking, so well-paid workers sustain demand. Saving is prudent for a family, but not for a government when the economy is in recession, and so on. So what about the one I guess we are kind of most familiar with, what's sometimes called neoliberalism, should kind of have quote marks around it. And here we have a more restrictive view of freedom from, or kind of negative freedom, and procedural justice as the normative foundations. The economic model expanded the idea of self-interest beyond individuals to include government officials. So Becker Buchanan was a crucial component of the complementary economic model. And here the welfare criteria shrank to a view of no interpersonal comparisons and the use of the Pareto criterion. Emblematic policies here, you can think of laissez-faire school vouchers, but privatization is obviously a very key element of this. And the kind of mantra, the words that we use, the government that governs best governs least. Labour unions are just special interest groups. There is no such thing as society. What we've experienced in COVID has highlighted, in some sense, some of the limitations of the prevailing paradigm. And one of those is we can see in terms of the exercise of unaccountable private power by private actors, and here in meat factories. So the point is that things that happen inside the firm may violate democratic norms. They only become salient in economic models when we recognize the fact of incomplete information, incomplete contracts within firms. And so in the last decades, we've had the information economics revolution coming to labor economics. Let me just take a longer view that we know that capitalism paired with liberal democratic values has produced high living standards. Since the 1970s, we also know that broadly shared affluence, or the growth of affluence, has given way to rising inequality, stagnant real wages in many countries, and the rise of authoritarian and nativist political movements. At the turn of the 1990s, transition was viewed as the affirmation of capitalism's golden age and as a triumph of the neoliberal paradigm, encapsulated in policymaking in the Washington Consensus, and a huge amount has happened since then. But the outturn in economics and politics, we know, has been more complex, and the pandemic has kind of turned the screw again. But what I would argue is that it's pushing us to go beyond neoliberalism, but not back to the Keynesian social democratic paradigm. So not just to some sort of Green New Deal. The claim is that paradigms change when problems change and where there is new economic theory. So we have to have the new economic theory. One way of finding out what the problems are is for us to ask our students. And so this is what some 8,000 first-year economics students from 40 universities in 18 countries over the last few years have said in terms of what they think the most pressing issue is that economists should address. So you can see it's a massive weight on inequality, but also sustainability. If you look more closely, you'll find globalization, migration, robots, the future of work, financial instability, all showing up there as the problems that we're facing. And just to focus in on the theme of the session, structural change in labour markets exposes the limits to previous paradigms. And as I mentioned at the outset, it's this shift in the nature of work away from routine tasks to more nuanced and complex tasks, plus the shift from easily monitored production of goods to difficult to monitor services that now dominate the economy. So it means that more work will be less routine and harder to monitor. So we're going to have to become more reliant on intrinsic motivation. This is less suited to the traditional capitalist firm because contractual incompleteness increases. And we can think of there being in this, as given this kind of structural and technological change, that there are three solutions for getting the work done. We've got reputation-based rewards, intrinsic motivation, and information sharing, like we saw in the speed of vaccine development. We've got using IT to monitor workers' every action, as we see implemented in logistics and many other sectors of the economy. And we've got using IT to substitute a platform technology for the capitalist firm so that what's being monitored is not the worker, but the output. So the output is monitored that, say, if we think of Uber or Deliveroo, and we return to a complete contract like the pre-capitalist putting out system. So this shrinks the share of work done in the economy organized in capitalist firms. Let me go back to the exam questions and try to argue that we do have good news, that economic theory, data, and empirical methods are available to help us move in the direction of a new model. Just a quick glimpse of the kind of theoretical foundations applicable to that set of problems that we face. Just glance down the right-hand side. And in terms of a new paradigm, what we perhaps need to do is to bring in a richer view of freedom, so including social relations free from domination, equal dignity and voice, community and sustainability. We've got the model, so we've got a model that now includes social preferences and private power in most obviously principal agent models. We have identity economics and so on. So I won't spend more time on this because I'm trying your patience. But just to suggest how we might think about this as against the market state one-dimensional line that sort of dominated policy discussion over recent decades, and I've just illustrated it here with environmental policies. So each pole refers both to the institution and to the motivations and social norms that make those rules work well. So let's suggest that, so you can just see we're using complementarity between government and markets here, between compliance with state authority and material incentives in those two, carbon tax and dividend versus cap and trade, for example. So what I'm suggesting is that in a forward-looking way, we have to open up the space in this simplex by introducing a third pole. So in that third pole, we have an additional set of motivations that we can include in our economic modeling, and that allows us to introduce their implementation through social norms and the exercise of private power. So we can deal with a whole lot of the developments that are happening in labour markets in a much more coherent way within this new framework. So this just gives a few examples of how we might be using the complementarity of these three poles. And just to highlight, that third pole of civil society is not some kind of warm, fuzzy place. It's where we can understand questions of identity, including in-group, and see the dark side of civil society that we need to understand a number of the developments that have occurred over the past decade or so. So that's where I'm going to stop. And thank you very much.
So thanks so much, Wendy, for this introduction. What I find amazing about this talk is two things. First, if I were a student 20 years ago, that kind of language would never be used in class. So this is really the new thing that is changing the way we're teaching economics right now, that we were not aware of. I shouldn't say in the beginning of transition, because I don't know how the beginning of transition looked, but that's what I'm trying to say. But the second thing is that this is really a new thing. This is not about making warm again yesterday's food. It's about really new ideas and how they can blend into the narratives about labor economics. Because what I thought when I was asked by Case to do this panel, to prepare this panel, is that we're actually in a very interesting moment of time. So the first interesting thing about the moment of time is that we have finally the data that allow us to tell if the models that were used in early transition are the models that describe the processes that took place in early transition. And that's super interesting and super cool, and there's growing literature on that. But we also see that these markets are no longer transition markets. They no longer have the features that we were fearing or thought that we need policy for. They're super standard, advanced European markets. And so we can learn a lot from this coincidence of these two elements. Now, I have prepared a couple of questions for our panelists, and I don't want to be talking a lot. So I'm just going to start from those questions, and I'm going to go start with Iga, if you don't mind. And my question for Iga would be, you and I share generational experience, but are there things that you have been most surprised to see in the data that we were not taught in school, or we were taught quite the opposite? Is there something about the evolutions in transition labor markets that is really surprising to you the most? Iga, we cannot hear you. I think you're muted again. I thought it's just we cannot hear you.
Thank you. It just doesn't show. I was muted, sorry. So thank you again for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And thank you, Wendy, for the very interesting and inspiring presentation. We're referring to Joanna's question. When I think about the data and what I was expecting to be different, or with the evolution of the Central Eastern European labor markets, I think there's one major thing that comes to my mind. I remember at the beginning of my working career, we were simulating how quickly the structural transformation of the Polish labor market would take place, how quickly people would move from agricultural sector to the service sector. And that has happened at much, much slower pace. We still have 10% of people working in the agricultural sector. I guess there are quite several institutional factors to blame. It's just a rational decision of many households to remain in the sector, given the incentives and disincentives in the tax benefit system and of the European common agricultural policies. But still, I remember when we were estimating, I was at the time working at the Ministry of Labor, we were estimating that the transformation, looking at the Spanish experience, we would be expecting to really to be at the level of a couple % of employment in the agricultural sector now. We are much far, the numbers are much higher now. And that is a very good question. How, given the other challenges that we have related to the technological advancement, to the demographic change, whether and how we are able to move away from the situation where we are now.
A splendid point. It's also quite specific to some of the transition countries that still have large agriculture. I think it's not just Poland, but it would be also the case of Bulgaria and probably Romania. Yeah. I remember myself working at a central bank, not the ministry, but people were saying, yeah, but demographics solves it all. So we looked into the data and we actually showed that there's more inflow of young people into agriculture than outflow of people retiring from the agriculture in all these three countries. So that's actually something that probably none of us expected to see in the data. So thanks for bringing that up. Wendy, is there anything you would like to add to this? Something that you found most puzzling about developments in our countries?
I wanted to just ask Igor a question, which is, okay, that's very interesting about the share in agriculture, but what about productivity? So in other words, we expect people moving out of agriculture because of higher productivity in industry and services. And alternatively, you could discover a comparative advantage in agriculture if you're able to increase productivity and take advantage, for example, of some particular dimensions of, the special features of the agricultural sector. So I want to kind of understand whether this is simply kind of lagged development or something different.
Again?
Now I'm not muted.
It's perfect.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think it's kind of a lagged development, given that we have 10% people working in agriculture, and productivity is like 2.5% of the value added. So that's a huge gap. And even if we compare it to like low-skilled services, the gap in productivity is 3.5, threefold. So that's quite a large gap. So it's more, I think, about the incentives that come from the pension system, from the tax benefit system, and as we said, the common agriculture policy.
That's exactly my answer, Wendy. It's not TFP, it's CAP. Martin, would you be able to chip in with your surprises?
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. And first, let me congratulate Kay's 13th anniversary, Madam Chair and Madam President, and everybody. That's absolutely fantastic. And congratulations. Thank you for having me. Greetings to Wendy, Iga, and Jan. It's great to have you. Now, the question is, of course, very difficult because I have to admit that I didn't expect something, but that may be part of the answer because when we were observing these countries like Slovakia, maybe Poland, in the late 90s, early 2000s, we already saw some of the demographic developments. We saw migration, especially after joining the European Union. And there was this expectation that, well, these countries experience relatively quite high unemployment rates, hitting nearly 20% of the labor force, and already then we thought, okay, but the changing demography and migration, that could result in change and unemployment rates going down at some point. But what was surprising to me, how quickly that change occurred, at least in these two countries, maybe Slovakia in particular, but how quickly the markets have transitioned from markets of slack of high unemployment rates into markets which are now kind of polarized in a sense, or there is segmented, where you still have a segment which is where the underemployment is very high, and this is regional, this is across age groups, these are specific groups, there is exclusion, and so some people continue to be excluded from labor market opportunities. But then you have a market which is super tight, where there is lack of qualified labor, and this is actually a major drag on the economy, that the human resource managers cannot find enough qualified people at the right place, right time. And overall, unemployment rates have gone down steeply. Of course, there's some crisis, so there were bumps in this process, but that transition was very rapid. But and the market became very segmented, and that. And what was perhaps surprising was, at least in my case for me, how quickly that transition occurred, and that did have, and the broader context of this was, of course, as well that narratives matter, and for policymakers, narratives are very important, and they importantly affect how these problems are dealt with. And the fact that the transition was rather fast resulted in also a bit of a mismatch between what I thought the real problems were at the time and what the narratives, what the policy discourses were. And there was another mismatch. Yes? Policymakers still were discussing high unemployment rates, whereas it wasn't the averages that were anymore the main problem. It was more the dispersion of fates, of opportunities, that has always been a problem, but how it became polarized and how the markets have been segmented, that was something that policymakers, at least in my view, did not grasp soon enough, so to say, given the transition.
Do you share this experience, Jan, or do you have another bigger surprise than the one that Martin shared with us?
Have big surprises. No. So I'll supplement it. I agree with everything, and thank you everybody for having me. It's been terrific to observe case develop over the decades, and in a small part on the advisory board to be part of it. So I think this is really a big reason to celebrate. So to our questions, our topics, I have several observations that I think are important. So first, I think the unemployment phenomenon that has been discussed was very important at the beginning. I think had huge political repercussions. If you look at the countries where unemployment went high, basically the reformers were voted out of office very fast, democratically. Czech Republic, which was an exception, had low unemployment rate. People stayed in office for a long time because people were not unhappy. It also contributed significantly, something that's not very well known, for the disintegration of Czechoslovakia, because in Slovakia, unemployment was double digits high, and policymakers wanted to go slow. And the Czech Republic, it was 2 to 3%, and policymakers wanted to go fast. So there was it wasn't just political factors and cultural factors and others. It was really, to a significant extent, the unemployment phenomenon. People were not used to unemployment, so it was a shock. Right? So that, I think, was important. Second thing, which is interesting, that studies are indicating, is that in these economies, as the transition took place and market forces started operating, inequality would have been very high. So when you look at what happened, inequality due to market forces rose dramatically, and it was the social safety net, the pensions, the unemployment benefits, and all that brought it back. So when you look at Gini coefficients and everything, you say, well, these countries remained very egalitarian relative to everybody else, but it was thanks to the intervention that was there. Effectively, social safety net was strong, because if you look what happened without that, it would have been Gini going to 40s, even 50, numbers. So it's important to realize how those two play together, especially going to Wendy's new models, etc., because you can see that these forces are really powerful in the Big Bang era of labor markets. The third thing that I think is important to me, I'm surprised as a labor economist, is how long in this whole region wages are remaining relatively low compared to the rest of Europe, where there are no frictions, ease of movement, and so on and so forth. So one can say, yes, in absolute terms, wages have risen, which is true, but relative to the market with which these countries are integrated, they're still low. And even take the Czech Republic, which before the Second World War and after the Second World War had wages equal to Germany and Austria, right? So these went from 25% 30 years ago to like a third or 40% of German and Austrian wages, and still remain there, right? So some equalization is not taking place. And even as you go to the border region, they are not rising. So it's not like in Mexico, where near the US border, wages are 3 times as high as in central Mexico because the gradient goes up. Here, the labor market is not equilibrating. totally integrated labor market areas. Okay, so I think that's something that deserves a little bit more. I see Wendy is ready to speak. I have some question on Wendy's presentation, which I think is terrific, and I think I applaud the work that you guys have been doing. It's really terrific. And what I have is, in the last slide, you had a point about workers' involvement, and I was wondering whether that's sort of a minor thing or whether it's supposed to be a big part of the paradigm, in the sense that there is a huge theoretical literature on participation labor managed firms, large number of empirical studies showing our producer cooperatives are doing relative to others, right? Problems with truncation, the most successful firms being acquired by capitalists. So we don't see the best performing firms in the data and so on. So technical issues of that kind. And it was a big issue. I remember when I was doing my dissertation on German co-determination, the big question in Germany was, was the German miracle because of co-determination, workers' participation in management, or despite that, right? So where does that fit into your model, which was more kind of outside of the firm? And in the last slide, I noticed, you brought it in. So that's my introductory set of remarks.
So given that Wendy wanted to comment on whatever Jan has said and that Jan has asked the question to Wendy, please, Wendy, the floor is yours.
Yeah, no, just one question, another factual question I'm trying to figure out to Jan. It's this border question, and I guess to frame it slightly differently, this question about wage convergence. I'm interested in knowing the extent to which the dispersion of productivity between foreign-owned firms and domestically owned firms is part of this story. So not quite thinking of borders geographically, but thinking of the border of the firm. How is the convergence of wages in foreign-owned firms for particular skill categories or task categories? So, because one of the things you might say, very striking things about the Central and Eastern Europe is the fact that they are more open than any comparable countries, even than the small open economies in the European Union, and they have this really internally this geographical split between main urban areas with foreign-owned firms and the rest. So it sort of comes back to my agriculture question as well. Talking about averages in terms of wage convergence, I just wanted to push you a little bit on that. And on your second point about co-determination and absolutely, this is the inside the firm is absolutely crucial to thinking about the labour market going forward, because unless we have that triangle where we have a place for the exercise of private power, which our models provide us with, but we just tend to sit along that one dimension, then once we recognize that we are interested in what goes on inside the firm, then questions about how different ownership forms work become very salient, and the interaction between that and the new kinds of technology is what I think is going to be that's what we should be working on. So based on all that early work on co-determination and producer-owned co-ops and so on, then we kind of need to be moving to the next phase of empirical work to try and understand how with the increased difficulty of monitoring, these different ownership forms may have a larger role to play.
So before I let Jan reply and completely lose control over this panel, I want to emphasize to everybody who's listening to us that wherever you're listening to our panel, you can ask us questions. There is a chat module on the streaming platform where you're watching this panel, and whichever question you ask, it's going to pop up on my little device on my knee, and then I can pass your question on to the members of the panel. So please feel free to do that. And Jan?
All right. So yeah, I think the answer to what Wendy was saying is sort of twofold. So one phenomenon that you see in traditional market-based capitalist studies is that you do have difference in productivity among the large, often multinational type firms and the small firms, right? So that you observe in these transition economies as well. And as wages go up, obviously the marginal productivity where firms close down or decrease scale and so on. But I think what you were driving at was sort of comparison across borders, whether the multinationals in these economies pay similarly as they do elsewhere in the world. They don't. They impose the same corporate culture. So that part is important. Corporate governance and so on is pretty much the same across. But wages in the multinational firms, while higher than the domestic ones, in the same location, are much lower than in the parent headquarters companies or elsewhere. So I give you one example that I know concretely, and that Škoda Works Automobile and Volkswagen, parent Volkswagen. So everybody, including the management, agreed that the productivity is the same, maybe even higher in Škoda in Czech Republic. And wages a year ago, when I saw the last one, on average were 39%, labor cost 39% in Škoda of what it was in Wolfsburg in Germany. So that kind of differential seems to be persisting, is persisting even 30 years. So it's a long-term difference which is there. At the borders, there are workers who cross borders, the frontalier, the pendlers, who go back and forth to get the higher wage, not completely, still low wage across the border, but how much higher than there. But you don't see foreign firms that operate on the Czech side, let's say, of the border to really raise the wages completely to what you see on the other side of the border. So big difference even there. All right.
If I can add to that, there's probably two elements. So if Thomas Havranek was here, or anybody from at that time Hungarian Central Bank, or probably Bulgaria, Romania, we were actually very proud to keep our unit labor cost at 1. We wanted to be like Germans. We didn't want our wages to grow. So whoever in the whole region was at a given point in time experiencing a high unit labor cost growth, which suggests wages were catching up to Western Europe, this is the moment when central bankers were unhappy. So, I mean, that could be one of the reasons. I mean, obviously central bankers couldn't do anything about it, but the narrative was that you're the good guy if you're keeping your wage growth in check. But the other thing is that we're probably not talking about the same type of manufacturing. So I have no idea about cars, and I'm riding a bike, just for anybody who doesn't know me to clarify the point. But if you're doing a Škoda on one side of the border, and you're doing what's the Volkswagen doing, whatever type of Volkswagen on the other side of the border, the marginal productivity of labor could be the same, but marginal revenue brought by 1 hour of labor would be different, exactly because Škoda is a cheaper car than for Volkswagen. So to the greatest extent, we have real economic powers at play, that you're paid for the value of your work and not exactly for the output of your work, right? So in a sense, the fact that our wages are still catching up is to some extent, obviously, simply an exemplification of the fact that we're paid for what it's worth and not what it is. In very simple terms. But this is a super interesting question and discussion between the two of you. And I think almost everybody in the panel mentioned the word inequality. Wendy had that as the key concern of the students around 40 countries around the world. So one thing that I thought is super interesting from our perspective, and this is where I would like to hear your inputs, is that, as Jan rightly pointed out, inequality has not spiked in Central and Eastern Europe as some have feared in early transition. Actually, until as we go, it's still lower than in many Western European countries. It doesn't mean that the poverty is lower, but inequality is lower. So one of the things that I find surprising, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that, is, aren't you surprised that inequality is such a big thing, despite in narratives, despite it being pretty much in check in terms of numbers, or is my interpretation of what's going on wrong? Iga, could you start?
Sure. Can you hear me? Great. So I guess the issue is that it's we have somehow two separate debates on inequality as such among experts who try to measure that, discuss the measurement problems, etc. And then we have the perception of inequality. And I think it's the perception of inequality that is changing and driven by several other factors. I think that in the discussion now we are, when thinking about inequality as such, it's not so much about wage inequality or income inequality. It's much more about like being somewhere in the ladder of, for example, working conditions. I think there are, for example, several aspects of inequality that are emphasized much more nowadays, like working conditions, like the quality of jobs, which has several dimensions itself, like the quality of health or precariousness or stability at job. So I think that those dimensions have changed a lot over the past 15 years when we think about Central Eastern European markets after the EU entry in particular. And those are the issues that come to my mind when I think about the overall debate about inequality. So I think that's the major issue. It's not so much about income or wage as such. The second thing I want to mention is that from my perception, what is changing is also the inequality in skills. And that's more like forward-looking, but we see that there is already a large disparity in skills, in particular digital skills that different generations have, and that is going to be even more dispersed and even more a challenge in the years to come, given the technological change that Wendy was mentioning. So I will stop here for as the first few thoughts I had.
Martin, you talked about polarization in Slovakia and your perception of. So, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I very much agree with Iga. What we've seen, we studied Slovakia, Czech Republic some time ago, and what we could see was rather, a little bit of an increase in the very early 90s, but then, stabilization of standard measures of inequality, like the Gini coefficient, sometimes a bit slightly higher, sometimes lower, but not increasing, and relatively compared to other countries, rather low. And this was at least for two reasons which enabled this. The redistribution, the demand for redistribution itself, and relatively healthy public finances, which provided for this. Yes, that it was possible to have relatively generous social security systems, which prevented inequality from rising in spite of increasing market inequality. Now, what, however, is possibly driving the current discourses about inequality are the extremes. So that's what I mentioned already, because what you see is pockets of poverty in Slovakia. In particular, you see some regions which are sort of left behind. They do not participate in the new model of prosperity, and there are some groups, ethnic groups, Roma, but also some others which are not fully participating, and sometimes far from that in the new in the new prosperity, if you like. And so you have this at one extreme. At the other extreme, you see oligarchy. Yes, you see some people who have gained a lot of power, economic resources, and then observing this polarization, this variation, people feel that there is some kind of injustice going on in the country, and that's what makes them unhappy about the overall situation. That maybe. And one more point, actually, that's what Iga mentioned as well, and this is something I wanted to make, because part of the question was is this going to continue, or are there some mines in this? And indeed, I agree with Iga that when you look at, say, education, you see how much of inequalities are bubbling already in there, and COVID, for example, very much exposed those inequalities. at least in my country, you could see, our kids go to school, and the school gave computers to every student, every pupil, even though they didn't need it. Most of the parents probably could provide some kind of computer or some kind of access for the online instruction. But then you have schools, and there's been statistics on this, that tens of thousands of pupils did not have any online education, and not even any education pretty much during the lockdowns. And so this is creating enormous enormous driver of inequality for the future, where there'll be huge polarization of the quality of students who will be graduating from educational system.
So when I heard Martin mention oligarchs, I know I have to ask Jan. So yeah.
Yes, we do have the experience. Yeah, and I was going to add, in fact, that I think one of the things that we observe, and that is creating controversy and unhappiness among people, is the distribution of wealth. It used to be that there was relatively egalitarian distribution of wages, but also wealth, because under socialism, nobody could accumulate too much wealth. And now you sort of observe that capital is really what's driving it, and it's obviously financial capital, and you see the rise of oligarchs and through them political influence. Some of them go directly into politics. The Czech prime minister is a good example. Some play behind the scenes but are very influential. Some acquire media and therefore have huge political influence that way. So I think that's important, the political economy aspect of it. I think generally capital is important because if you have high human capital, you're doing relatively well. If you have financial or physical capital, you're doing relatively well. It's the low-wage earners and others who are sort of in the category of not having any capital, I think, that are suffering and obviously unhappy in the way things have developed.
Wendy, you live in one of the most unequal European countries, but at the same time you have very egalitarian views. So would you want to comment on that?
Well, I think what Jan said is what everyone said, actually, I found extremely interesting. And I think one problem is that we should not think about inequality, just think about measuring it with a one-dimensional, just a single measure. So if we just look at the post-tax Gini, then we can get a very strange impression, a misleading impression. And I did actually look at the numbers the other day, and Hungary is amazing, because it has one of the highest Ginis for market income and a low Gini for post-tax income. So it has the highest redistribution ratio of all the countries that I could look at. And that in itself, I think, is a really interesting sort of political economy question about, what is supporting that redistribution ratio, and is that sustainable? So that's one issue. The question of wealth concentration is something that we should all be doing much more research on than we have to date. People should be doing much more research on. But I have a third question, which is again, it was an empirical question, which is, what do we know about intergenerational mobility in these countries? Because this kind of captures this idea about whether there really are losers, persistent losers that are going across generations. Someone must know the answer to this question.
Thank you, Wendy. I think the amazing part in the debate about inequality is that we have a really strong polarization of views on this, right? So in a sense, there's still a lot of people who say you're worth what you're paid, and I'm paid a lot, so I must be worth a lot, so I approve of what we're going. But then there's much more sensitivity to egalitarianism in European societies in general, and I think Central and Eastern Europe is pretty standard in this respect, which is one of the things that Wendy pointed to. So how do we get support for so much redistribution? Apparently, there's some support for more support for redistribution in some of the Central and Eastern European countries than in others. But I thought the recent experience in Germany is super interesting, because with imposing relatively high minimum wage, what they made sure is that there is redistribution within firms and not through the tax system. And that's, I mean, we've already have a couple of years of experience with this instrument and how it's operating. And what empirical evidence seems to suggest is that the main result of this policy was that people moved from low-paying firms to high-paying firms, because low-paying firms simply couldn't keep up. But that there were no negative employment effects in Germany. Now, you compare that with any massive increase in minimum wage in the countries in our region, and you see large, usually negative employment effects. Even if they're not homogeneous, they don't affect all the groups. There is negative effects of minimum wage hikes. So it's really interesting to see how we're still different, and how perhaps not the same instruments would be working and wouldn't be working. So I'm totally changing the plan of the debate. But one question I really wanted to ask you is, do you see, because I mean, there is a big elephant in the room called populism in those countries rising. It's not just Poland, it's not just Hungary. All of the countries are struggling with a much bigger influence of populist politics. And do you believe there is a strong link between inequality and this, or is it just skill of some politicians to be able to harness support? And you don't talk about specific countries.
I mean, I'm interested to listen more than to talk about this in terms of the region, but this question of winners and losers in the face of the technological and trade changes that have happened was really neglected for a long time, and economists were not really very focused on it. But we need to be able to connect that with what we've now learned about identity and identity economics. And what that tells us is that this isn't just material well-being. There are other dimensions that really, really matter to people. And anyone who even took a tiny interest in the Brexit debate will understand that, because very many of the losers in material terms of Brexit were they I don't think this is a question of people not knowing. They nevertheless wanted it to happen. So people now say they're reaping the whirlwind. Well, but it's not actually clear at all in opinion polls. It still seems to be the case that very few people have changed their minds, in spite of learning even more from the practice than economists and others were telling them ex ante. So I think we do need this richer understanding that goes beyond just material losses in a material sense. And it does include this sort of intergenerational element, because it's got to do with people's hopes and aspirations. And I think that's been very much at the heart of some of the identity politics that we need to take on board.
But isn't it a bit idealistic to assume we can satisfy everybody's aspirations and hopes? I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. Iga, your thoughts?
Well, I fully agree. It's just not, this link that you mentioned. I guess there is a link. I know I'm a labor economist, not a political economist, so I'm not really expert on that. But this link, I think, is much more about different aspects of identity, as you said, of perceptions of inequality in different aspects of inequality, rather than the income inequality or wage inequality itself. And just to pop up here, when you ask about this inequality of opportunity, I was actually looking at that some time ago. And from our research at that time, was I think 2015 or 16, so quite a few years ago already. But I remember one interesting result that Hungary, which indeed has a very low level of income inequality, had at the same time quite high, or the highest among CEE countries, level of this unfair inequality of opportunity. whereas in Poland they were much closer to each other. So indeed that, and the fact that the country has a low income inequality doesn't mean that it's a fair degree of inequality. Yeah, so that's my thoughts on that.
Martin?
Well, when you think about the past 30 years, when the transition started, I think there was relatively solid perception or support for redistribution and for keeping the society somehow coherent. And what was the focus of those discussions and thoughts was the flow, was the income, and that was support for redistributive policies. But people have difficulties distinguishing flow and stock. And stock is maybe less visible as well. And now we are in a different stage where what also Jan mentioned, there is growing wealth inequality at the extremes, and the societies are somehow not quite ready for that. There is much opposition, in fact, in my country, but I can imagine also in other countries, much opposition. People are against taxes on wealth, and they compare it to nationalization, and so then you have much polarization in terms of wealth inequality, and going a bit closer to the question of how labor situation may matter for polarization. What also Sergei Guriev was speaking yesterday has summarized this very nicely. Summarize evidence on it, and evidence tells us that the evidence that we have is that market disruptions due to globalization, technological change, and the spikes in unemployment rates due to all kinds of crises, they indeed increase populism. They feed into they fuel populism in the countries. And of course, there are other factors: cultural backlash, identity politics, and social media create a sort of ecosystem in which such disruptions resonate and result in and are politicized. And then we have growing populism and polarization along the political spectrum. So I guess that's my answer to this.
Jan?
Right. So I think that I agree with what was said. So I'll just try to add to it a little bit. I think that I see also this rise of populism in being enabled by rising inequality and political ability to succeed at the polls. I think it's not just the success of the populists, but it's the lack of opposition's lack of ability to similarly influence voters. That in a number of countries, the opposition parties are just not as capable. So that inequality is also, coming to the forefront in my mind. I think that another phenomenon which is similar and relates to the intergenerational issue is, and this is broader, I think, than the region, is that the young people seem to have a different view of the labor-leisure choice than the older generations, that they want much more emphasis on leisure, and HR people will tell you, we have real problem. They don't want to work the way, this company works, and, part-time, we have to adjust actually to them and so on. So that's an interesting, I think, phenomenon. To what extent that really is going to shape things, or will the younger people adjust and become the workaholics like their parents and grandparents and so on? Maybe back to, if I may, to the issue of taxes and wages and so on. I think the interesting thing about the region is that it started in a very traditional philosophical paradigm where income taxes, for instance, were in a number of countries not progressive, flat, right? They would call it equal, etc. And sometimes there were proposals that people should pay just the same absolute amount, not even the same percentage, amount. And so that, fed into then sort of these low wages. People are lazy. During the pandemics, I was working a little bit with the Czech government, and it was very difficult. In fact, we were not successful to persuade some of the key ministers, etc., that the people who became unemployed during the pandemic suddenly were not lazy. That it wasn't that they were not willing to work. This was actually a shock. So that the philosophical sort of state of mind is important. That it's still there. And it translates to what Joanna was saying. You have shortage of labor in the region in many, many places, but firms are not willing to react by increasing the wage. It's just that equilibration of the market. They'll say yes in the strawberries. If there is a shortage of strawberries, the price can go up or should go up. That's the natural. But in the labor market, that's not how they view it. So there is just a reticence to increase the compensation.
I think this is a super interesting point, because also part of the region is Baltic states, and I don't know how familiar you are with the situation in the Baltic states, but they experience 10 years of 10% per year real wage growth, and that's fine. I mean, nothing's going out of business. Firms are surviving, country's still there. People don't get, they don't earn too much money to continue to work. I mean, things work, and it's just that we don't see them in Central and Eastern Europe, like south of Baltic Sea, evolving the same way. So that's super interesting to see. What I was also surprised to see was how much there was wage growth, despite being highly regulated, in Belarus. We were supposed to have a person from Belarus in the panel, but the things are the way they are. So we couldn't get representatives to join us because of the dreadful political situation in this country. But I didn't share my surprise, but my biggest surprise was that Belarus was the second best performing transition economy since 1989. The first one is Polish. But in terms of growth rates, not in terms of income levels, obviously, but in terms of growth rates, Belarus is the second most best performing transition economy. That to me was a huge shock, also in terms of real wage growth, not just income per capita. But I must say, I don't know how about the audience, but me personally, I didn't extract from you whether you believe that there is a strong link between inequality and populism or not. So Wendy was arguing that we have this identity element kicking in, and this identity element is what transforms perception of inequality to political support to populism, if I understand correctly what you said, Wendy. But I still didn't get the answer from Iga, Martin, and Jan. Do you believe there is this strong link, or should we just go back to the drawing board and start doing better politics to avoid that situation?
What I said was that unemployment and labor market disruptions, they are driving the populism, and those, of course, I didn't say inequality, but those are also driving forces behind inequality.
But we have historically the lowest unemployment, Slovakia and Poland, and historically quite some support from.
Yeah, but you can see that when unemployment is going up, and when there is a polarization in the labor market, some groups are left behind, and especially their future opportunities, because they also read this as their future opportunities are diminishing. Then you have increase in populism, and so it's not a complete answer, but at least from that channel, labor market disruptions result in or feed into increased populism.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
Which is, to what extent is this a rural-urban issue in the region?
This is a great question, and it's also somebody in a panel asked us the question on the chat function: if income convergence in Central and Eastern Europe was mostly driven by metropolitan areas, and then everybody else is still lagging behind. So is this an accurate description of what's going on or not? Who wants to answer? Iga, Jan, Martin?
I can try give a few words. So I think, so this links also, Jana, to your question about historically low unemployment rates. Yeah, but at the same time, the activity rates are also quite low, right? So I think my sense is that many people feel left, they are pushed outside the labor market. So we don't see them in the unemployment statistics just because, and many of them do live in the rural areas, especially, and this links to the huge question of public transportation, which was basically eliminated. So for many of those people, the labor markets, that they are not really accessible, and especially given the low wages. So I guess these are all factors that somehow linked with this identity issue do contribute to there being a link between labor market situation and populism. Would populism exist or increase and develop like the way it has in the past years without those labor market inequalities? I don't know that.
Jan?
I think it is a question of transportation. In other words, it is urban-rural to the extent that transportation is not very good. But you see that in situations where a highway is built or a speed train is built, suddenly the rural areas start thriving and people commute, or, and sometimes, in fact, like to live outside of the city and commute into the city, or vice versa for that matter. So yeah, I think it exists. The differentiation is there, but I think it's significantly given by modern transportation infrastructure or lack thereof.
Okay. So I hope that also answers the question from the panel. Please ask us more questions. I'm sure the panelists would be happy to answer. There's a question from the floor.
Thank you very much. I would like to dig more into this observation that Jan made about maintain big wage differences. I suspect that I have an explanation. Poland has lost 2 million people who have left to the west and gained 2 million people who have come from the east, and mainly Ukrainians. And therefore, the Ukrainians get 3 times higher salary going to Poland, and the Poles get twice as high salary going to the west. That this is the explanation. For Ukrainians, it's easy to speak Polish. If I'm rightly informed, there are about 600,000 Ukrainians in the Czech Republic. Hungary has lost 1 million people in emigration to the west and gained about 1 million of ethnic Hungarians from other countries. So I wonder if this can explain it. It also fits with what Joanna says about the Baltic countries, and the Ukrainian situation is similar. The dollar salary has gone up from $200 a month on average in 2015 to today almost $500 a month, with massive real wage increases, because about 6 million Ukrainians have left for the West. So that we are seeing in much of Eastern Europe. I mean, there are 3 Baltic states, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, that about 1/3, Bulgaria, that about 1/3 of the population has left, while Central Europe has pretty stable population because of this exchange of population. It might not explain the Czech Republic, but I think it does explain Poland pretty well. Thank you.
Any thoughts from the panel?
Yeah, if I may, I think that's right in the sense that mechanism is there. I am just surprised how strong it is. That yes, there is immigration, but there is immigration, in other parts of the world as well, including Western Europe, and the effect is not as strong as to sort of prevent the labor market from equilibrating. In fact, the pandemic is a very good one because the inflow of Ukrainians and others has been temporarily diminished, if not stopped. And wages are rising, but they're not rising that dramatically. So in other words, it's going to be a maybe 5% increase, but not a huge jump. And the complaining about the shortage of labor is much more intense now than it was before. But the intensity was there even before. I mean, there was a IMF conference on shortage of labor together with the Croatian Central Bank a few years ago. So this is a long-term phenomenon in the presence of the influx of workers from the East. And the step migration, indeed, is what you see now. Eastern go to Central, Central go to Western, and so on. So that's there, but still, even in the presence of it, there is not much more equilibration, and there is obviously mobility across, border workers going from France to Switzerland and vice versa. That's always there. So the mobility is present throughout. It's just a question of why there is so much difference. I mean, I can see 20, 30%, even the South traditionally in the US and North, you would have a 20% differential. That will not be eliminated. But why is it more than 100% differential, right? Or 200%? That's the big question.
Another interesting, any other comments from the panel?
Maybe very briefly about migration and mobility. What we have shown, what we see, is that immigration is relatively strongly associated with decreasing inequality. So in a receiving country, so we see there, and also there is evidence on that outmigration actually decreases unemployment and push and create some upward pressure on wages in the sending countries. So if we take this as causal, which we maybe are not yet comfortable with, but then you could see this as a win-win, that labor mobility, migration actually decreases inequality in both sending and receiving countries.
So I'm a very micro person, and to me, for these things to make sense, I need to see like a person-for-person type of transition. So one thing we know for a fact is that these were not the unemployed who left. It was the workers who left. And so it wasn't a direct driver of unemployment. And I think it's a common phenomenon around the Central and Eastern Europe for the whole period of so-called accession migration. And that's something we should keep in mind. But something that I found really puzzling, to the extent to which I actually started a research project on that, but it's not ready to publish yet. It's not person for person, the Ukrainians coming to Polish people going elsewhere. It's actually different locations, different demographics, different skills, and different occupations, let alone industries. So it's not, I understand that it was like 1 million working elsewhere and 1 million coming here, but it's not something that can explain, because it's not workers for the same employer with the same wage that he could use this to explain your mechanism. So there must be something more about it, but I'm still not able to say yet what. But your question was fantastic because it allows us to smoothly transition to another question to our panel, is that if you look at countries of our region, we have been traditionally immigration countries. People were leaving from here to leave elsewhere. Now, it seems like we're in a pretty interesting moment of history when it's about to change. And I don't only mean about the experience of Ukraine. I mean, the war and all sorts of push factors from Ukraine make this country right now very prone to emigration. And our countries are on the winning side of that. But are we going to become immigration countries? And are we going to be able to cope with the challenge that's associated with influx of people of varied backgrounds? Should I be picking speakers, or maybe somebody volunteers?
I'll start. My sense is that it's a problem of the varied background. Okay, my sense as I'm reading the philosophical, political mentality of people, they have been willing to absorb in migration of people who are similar backgrounds. So you'll say Ukrainians. For some reason, there's been an incredible aversion of people who come from Syria, Afghanistan, etc. So I think it's the cultural aspect that's really powerful here, as opposed to the economic one.
Wendy, living in the most diverse European country that there is, have any insights for Central and Eastern Europe, who has become so homogeneous in the post-war period that we don't even understand the word diversity anymore?
I don't really have. I have nothing particularly to add. I think what Jan said is interesting. It's something we have to understand. Again, I think we're beginning to assemble tools in economics to complement those in sociology and political science to make progress on this, but I don't have any special insights.
Iga?
My sense is that we have become a country that is already quite attractive in terms of in economic terms, in terms of GDP per capita, wages, etc. But we are becoming even more unattractive in terms of procedures and cultural issues as well. So I think that may be discouraging many people from coming or at least staying in Poland. So I don't know to what extent that will change. We know how that has. How the migration policy in Poland has developed and how unwilling we are to state that we do need migrants here. So I think these procedural issues, they will become an important factor discouraging people from choosing Poland rather than other Central Eastern European countries with similar level of development.
I think you're picking on something super important. I remember when the post-accession transition migration started, and suddenly there was some people in the UK, not just the RAF fighters and their and their families, and it was the same thing with Ireland. I mean, you land in Dublin and there's people waiting for you to speak to you in your native language. Same happened in Heathrow. There were stores, there was community building, there was huge involvement of the government of the hosting economies to create the sense of being welcome in those locations. Now, actually, there's much more Ukrainians coming to Poland than there was Polish going to the UK. I don't think we have a single sign in Cyrillic in the airport, and I do go there a lot. If I find any offer that is targeting that particular ethnic group, it's usually the commercial offers for money transfers, like Western Union is putting things in Ukrainian and mobile services putting things in Ukrainian and Russian, but we don't get much of it. Do you get that in Slovakia? Do you see any policy that's like supposed to harness?
No, we are lagging behind. But let me follow up on what Iga said, because that's exactly my kind of thinking about this. That economically, these countries already offer career opportunities for employers, but also for investment, which are interesting, which are maybe not firstly globally, but solid and attract immigrants. But because of different historical contexts, these countries are, generally speaking, not very welcoming for migrants. There is a lot of negative attitudes, negative perceptions, which then, however, and here I will elaborate on and expand the argument that Iga started, because there the big problem is that such negative attitudes affect voters' behavior and whom they won't vote into power. Now, that is likely to result in policies which are suboptimal, immigration and integration policies. If those negative attitudes, perceptions transpire into policies, those policies are not likely to be best possible, at least. And as a result, they will are likely to result in suboptimal, substandard outcomes of the migration experience. In terms of immigration and integration, but that then generates a vicious circle, because if the experience of the local resident population with immigration is not exactly there are some problems that they perceive, and then this feeds again into negative attitudes and fuels negative attitudes and perceptions. So through this vicious circle, if you start with negative attitudes, then through the policy, through voters' behavior and policies, they in fact may fuel the exact negative attitudes and perceptions that we started with. And so what I fear maybe for these countries, we started with very little immigration. We become attractive. You can see quite large numbers of immigrants in these countries, but because we are not quite ready to absorb, to enable, empower immigrants, to integrate them in economic and social life of the receiving societies, we may further down the line observe some negative outcomes, or at least substandard outcomes, not the first best outcomes, and as a result, there may be a bit of a societies may be facing problems with their migration experience, and that may further fuel the populist and the polarization, the political polarization that we observe already now.
Jan, do you have any optimism to sprinkle over this gloomy image, or are you going to continue on the same note of it's bad, it's going to get worse type of perception?
I'm not sure it's going to get worse, but I think it's a question of evolution which is broader than just economic aspects. Although the economic aspects are important because the migrants are also trying to find a place that's going to be most congenial for them at best. And, in some sense, Germany is much more attractive than any of the countries in Central Eastern Europe. So to the extent that they can get to Germany, they go to Germany. So sometimes you see them initially being located in one of the Central East European countries, but then migrate into Germany if they can, because just overall, economically, but also in terms of acquaintances, relatives, etc., they already have a place which is much more accepting along the lines, perhaps also that you, Joanna, have mentioned in terms of the institutions being there. So I think that the Central East European region is still not sort of an overall welcoming package for the migrants.
So we get a great opportunity, once in a lifetime historical opportunity, and it's probably not going to work as well for us as it could have. So we're going to end this panel pretty soon. So I have my favorite type of question for the end. But the audience should know the panelists were warned that they're going to be asked this question. So suppose you could get a time machine and you could go back to early 1990s, and suppose you could actually make somebody listen to you, which I understand wasn't exactly warranted at the time. And you could change only one thing. What would you change?
I may start. So I guess from my perspective, my background, I would say do not let people leave the labor market. Subsidize employment, create public jobs, whatever, but do not pay people to leave the labor market, because it's going to be very, very difficult to bring them back, and the lifetime cost of that policy will be huge.
Thank you, Iga. Wendy? We can't hear you.
Yes, sorry. This one is a fail. To think of one thing, I find extraordinarily difficult. So I'll have to pass.
Pass. Martin?
Well, it's a tough question because, of course, there may be many parameters that you could want to change. But let me just highlight one of those, which is that one of the biggest problems that these societies currently face is the growing oligarchism or some say mafia state in some of these countries. And so when I think what was one of the triggers of that, where it all somehow started, was the voucher privatization, where some people and some of them former security service people, they had some advantage, and that's where their wealth started. That was the initial trigger, and where they wealth started to accumulate. And nothing against wealth as such. It's great that we generate wealth, but if it's concentrated in the hands of a few, in a way it was, and when it results in this kind of oligarchic structures and mafia state, then I say, well, maybe we did something wrong there.
Mm-hmm. Jan?
I was there in 1990, and I actually did write a piece on the sort of optimal transformation. They're hard to select just one thing, but if I were to select one thing, I would say put much more emphasis on the creation of a functioning legal framework. To get the rules of the game established, both for the economic efficiency, but also for the acceptability to the people that it's a fair system, that you're establishing something where people don't rob, don't steal, but acquire based on merit. And so I think that was just not done sufficiently. I give an interesting initial sort of example. In early February, I think 1st February 1990, we had a meeting in Czechoslovakia at the time of Western economists of local origin and local policymakers. And this came up. And in fact, there was a lawyer from Brussels who said, the European Union has just established a legal framework for the Union as opposed to European Community. Why don't we bring the 45 lawyers here and they can graft onto your system the EU legal system so that you're going to be heading there anyway. So you might as well have a good legal system which has been carefully thought through, it's integrated, it's coordinated, it's internally consistent. And that was rejected. That was just seen as not acceptable. Literally, there is a Czech term for not acceptable. Just can't go through. And so, I think all the countries could benefit from having a much more fair and system with enforcement that really works and is internally consistent, as opposed to having a whole bunch of laws that are not necessarily coordinated. So that would be one thing that I think should have put more emphasis on.
So there's like half a minute, so I can add my one thing that I would change. I would collect much better data, and I would do much more database policy thanks to that, simply because we could inform policy instead of guessing what is the preferred outcome for one or the other political group. So let me thank the panelists for joining us, Ika, Wendy, Martin, and Jan. Thanks so much for being with us, and thank you for listening to us and giving us your feedback in the chat. I hope you're going to enjoy the other 3 panels in today's list of events. Thanks so much.
Thank you.